I'm not going to go scripted here as much. I think that with the historical context of just how this past 24 hours will be remembered, and whatever comes next from it, I think that it's best to kind of go unscripted mostly here. And so, majority of what I'll be saying will be unscripted, except for this part which I wrote and that off before we move forward. I'm gonna go through this whole situation down in the capital and down in the city of DC yesterday, on the micro and macro level, and just share my opinion and my reflection, as raw and unedited as possible. Um, and so, yesterday, January 6th, 2021, a date that will live in infamy, we saw our democracy come under attack from inside. Incited by the fallacies and falsehoods spewed by the sitting president, violent domestic terrorists sought to overthrow their own government and undercut their own democratic process. It failed, but I have a few questions for us all. Do we feel any better with the fact that it failed? Do we feel like this will just magically go away? And do we think any political misgivings are worth this? I think we're in really, really deep trouble. Unless those of us who have remained silent and uninvolved stand up against values that endanger us all. When you sit back and I don't do politics your way out of action, this is what your neighbors, family members, and friends end up doing. In the face of great challenges, we need great people to do great things. Do not sit back, do not be silent, do not condone this dangerous behavior. When, not if, this happens again, it will be because of people who don't do enough to stand in the way of it. Do better, do more. With that being said, I think it's really important to address the micro level. Like, what does this mean in the immediate sense? What, in relation to people storming the Capitol building in DC, what does that symbolize? What does that mean? And what are the direct consequences of that? First of all, this group of, from what I've seen, entirely or almost entirely angry white men storming the United States government's home, the United States government home of legislation, policy making, law making, and being successful in that act is amazing. When I saw those images of those terrorists storming that building, I thought to myself, maybe we are seeing the fall of our democracy, because that shouldn't happen. Something amazing to me, and I saw this, I can't remember who said it, might have been John King of CNN, but this same building 20 years ago, we are in the year 2021 now, 20 years ago, American citizens died defending so that a plane on 9/11 would not strike this building. Civilian citizens took it into their own hands when our country was under attack on a day much like yesterday, but from foreign adversaries. They stood up and defended that building with their lives, because that is how important that building is to our democracy. Our democracy lives within that building. More so, in my opinion, than it does within the White House. There are hundreds of elected officials, people chosen by the people, by us, to represent us, work within that building on any given day, supposedly enacting our will, and that's a different subject, but working on our behalf. This is an extension of us, the people. And yesterday, American citizens, domestic terrorists, tried to attack that. It's not lost on me that it's only 20 years ago that civilians took it into their hands to defend the same building, and 20 years later, civilians took it into their own hands to try to overthrow the government that works within that building. What happened in the last 20 years? What did we lose? I would argue that we lost ourselves. Somewhere along the way, somewhere in these last couple of years, we must have lost ourselves. Because regardless of your political stance, if you are conservative and you believe that we should be trying to balance the budget, or if you're a conservative and you want to maintain Christian ideals in American society, or whether you're liberal and you want to make sure that your neighbor is taken care of the same way that you are, and that you have the opportunity to be as equally represented in government as anyone else, whether you're gay or straight or black or white or immigrant or non-immigrant, all that stuff is meant to be political. All that stuff is meant to be decided within elections and voting. All of that stuff, we send our best to represent us within this building so that we can be defended in these ways. The politics is what protects us from things like yesterday. The politics is what keeps us from taking up arms against each other. It's no mistake that at many of these Black Lives Matter rallies over the summer, somehow, someway, politicians always ended up there. Much to my dismay, I hate to see the debate, the fight. It shouldn't really be a fight, but the fight for Black lives being made a political fight. It's not political. It's something that should just be accepted as a simple fact. Black lives matter. Black lives matter as much as white lives matter. Black lives matter as much as all lives matter. So when people say all lives matter, when people say things like blue lives matter, they negate that. They make it political. It's not a political argument. It's simple. So when we have uprisings like we did over the summer, and those become politicized, like I said, much to my dismay, because I don't think those are political arguments there. Black Lives Matter is a simple fact. It's not a political argument. Democrats don't own that. Republicans don't own that. It's just a fact. Why do we do this? Why do we involve it with our politicians? Because we look to these people to defend us. We look to these people to represent us. And that doesn't happen often enough, but we try. That's the whole point of politics. We try to find our best to go represent us and do as best as they can for us so that we don't have to take up arms against each other, so that we don't have to fight and shoot each other in the streets. That's what separates us. That's what makes us American. It's none of that other stuff that Donald Trump and his followers are aspiring for America to be. It's not standing for the pledge. It's not standing for a flag. It's not about whether or not you have a flagpole in your yard. Being American is about embracing simple values that are so extraordinarily unique throughout the rest of the world that we have always held ourselves to an ideal where we think we are the standard for democracy. Well, yesterday disproved that. We are not the standard. Some could argue that we have never been the standard, and we certainly are not heading towards being the standard at this current time. When our democracy stood its biggest test, we failed by my estimation. We could have done better than this. It's not about right or left. It's really not. It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's about respecting this democracy. Do you honestly think that Donald Trump respects this democracy? How could someone who respects this democracy go order his followers to do what he ordered his followers to do yesterday? The election is over. If Joe Biden would have lost, I would have been very, very disappointed. But I would have accepted it. Because one thing that keeps us being us is the ability to have a legitimate, recognized democracy. That peaceful transfer of power is so extraordinarily unique. Look at Russia. Do you think Donald Trump is closer to a Barack Obama or a Vladimir Putin? I say this because Barack Obama openly endorsed Hillary Clinton to be his successor. In 2016, when Barack Obama realized that Hillary Clinton would not be his successor, he immediately welcomed Donald Trump to the White House and helped to prepare him to be the most successful leader that he could be. Now, what Donald Trump took out of that meeting, I don't think it's plentiful. But former President Obama extended that olive branch, and regardless of the politics, he put nation first. Fast forward to 2020. Donald Trump has undoubtedly lost the 2020 election. It's not debatable. If you pay attention to the court cases where he challenged some of these findings, there is no factual evidence that suggests that anything else took place. When asked for actual evidence of elections fraud, and I quote, his attorney said there is a non-zero number when asked to provide examples. That's unbelievable. Donald Trump has no respect for our democracy. And this isn't a political statement. I don't care about Democrat, Republican. I don't. I don't particularly like Joe Biden as a candidate. I didn't want to vote for him. In the primaries, I didn't vote for him. What it came down to, though, is that he was a better option for our democracy. We don't have to get into the politics of it. That's the crazy thing about it, you know? We don't have to get into the politics about it. When you just compare character and who you want this country to be, if you want this country to represent what Donald Trump represents, I can't have any conversation with you at this point. You don't respect American ideals the way that you claim to. Perfect example of that is yesterday. These same individuals who over summer challenged the Black Lives Matter movement and stated that Blue Lives Matter and that black and brown people who were protesting police violence and oppression were violent thugs. The president himself saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And then yesterday happens, and these same people are using weapons against the police, raiding the Capitol while pepper spraying officers, chasing officers through the Capitol, bringing firearms inside the Capitol, trying to breach doors that were blockaded to get through, planting explosive devices around the city. I was at many of these Black Lives Matter protests. I stood there and I marched and I protest with my fellow citizens. And I never once saw someone use pepper spray against an officer. I saw people get pepper sprayed. I never once saw someone wielding a weapon anywhere near an officer. I saw officers draw their weapons. I never once saw someone chase an officer. I saw officers chase down and tackle multiple individuals. Why is it that this is so different? And this is where I move to the macro level. Why is it that a group of angry white men can get such dramatically different results than black and brown people marching for protection of their friends, family, and loved ones? The Black Lives Matter protests were not a political issue. It wasn't about an election. The Black Lives Matter protests were about people not feeling safe in their own communities and their own skin. Their skin making them a target of people who their taxpayer dollars employ. Why are these circumstances so differently represented? I don't understand that. No, actually, I do. If we're being real, we know, and I have known for quite a while, that the police, law enforcement at large in the United States of America was never formed to protect black and brown people. It was never formed to hold white people accountable. Law enforcement at large in the United States of America was formed to oppress and abuse black and brown individuals. It's that simple. That's not a radical statement in 2021. On January 7th, after yesterday, we saw bombs planted around the city of Washington, D.C. What would we call that if it was done by Al-Qaeda? What would we call that if it was done by ISIS? What would we call that in the 60s if it was done by the Black Panthers? We would call it terrorism. Is it different because of the act, or is it different because of the actor? You see what I mean there? Is it different because of what was done, or is it different because of who did it? These are terrorists. Let me ask another question. If this had been done by the Black Panthers in 1960, let's say like 1965, when things were real tumultuous, do you think that the FBI would have allowed them to leave the city limits without bullets in their backs and their heads? Do you think that if Al-Qaeda planted bombs around Washington, D.C., that there wouldn't be a severe reaction, probably in the forms of airstrikes, military conveying down the city? Do we think that? Do we think that? Do we really believe that this wouldn't have been different if this was black and brown people? No. So why is that? Is that just happenstance? Is that just coincidence? You know, these things happen. Sometimes police have good days, sometimes they have bad days. You just caught them on a bad day. No. Come on. It's the U.S. Capitol. If you haven't been to D.C., it is the most policed place in the country, and you can see it and you can feel it. I'm a Wizards fan. Washington Wizards. It's a painful existence, but I'm loyal to my region. I'm from the DMV originally. The Wizards haven't been good for long, but I've been to quite a few Wizards games, and I have never seen such a heavy police presence anywhere. And that arena, Capital One Arena, is a few blocks away from the Capitol building, the National Mall, the White House. It's not far at all, pretty much walking distance. The closer you get to that area, the heavier you feel that presence, and it becomes more militaristic as you get closer. I'm talking about snipers visible. The gates at all of those government buildings are heavily guarded. This is not something that you can just walk up to. Even on a non-organized day like this, you know, on an average Wednesday, I think it's the last time I was in DC. I think it was like a cold Wednesday before the pandemic hit. I think it might have been 2019. There was no way I could have gotten into any of those buildings without some kind of special clearance. If I would have tried, I would have certainly been shot. Armed or unarmed. How does this happen? A couple of videos shown yesterday answer this question perfectly. The first one I want to address is one where an officer is seen taking selfies with these terrorists. Now, would a TSA agent take a selfie with an Al Qaeda operative? No. Would an officer take a selfie at a Black Lives Matter protest with someone wearing a Defund the Police shirt? No. That officer took a selfie with someone who was committing an act of treason, in the middle of the act of treason. Literally in the middle of it. They were inside the Capitol at that point, and the officer smiles and takes a selfie with the person committing treason. The person he's supposed to be fighting against in that moment. Another video shows the officers moving the barricades out of the way so that these terrorists could advance further towards the Capitol. Now, I've seen these barricades at these protests. Like I said, I've been at many of these protests. I've also been to near these buildings. I haven't been inside the Capitol, actually, unfortunately. But I've been close enough to see these barricades on numerous occasions. Most times you can't get too close to secured areas. Even walking up to the barricades is probably ill-advised. I've never once seen them abandon posts. Not at the protests, not at these buildings. I've never seen it. Never. And I've seen overwhelming crowds converge on these barricades at these protests. I've seen crowds of people converge down towards the positions of these officers so they can protest in these officers' faces. Never once seen the barricades move. I've never once seen them abandon that position. In fact, I've seen them hold that position and call in reinforcements to ensure that they don't have to abandon that position. In the video that I'm referring to, which I can't show right now, but the video that I'm referring to, there was maybe 5 or 6 officers holding that position. So to answer the question of how this happened, one, with the officer taking the selfie, that wouldn't have happened in any other case because that officer would not have identified with anyone else in that moment. That officer took that selfie because he saw himself. He saw someone that reminded him of himself. He saw someone that thought like him. In that second instance, in that video where they moved the barricades and where there's only a couple officers holding the position against hundreds of thousands of protesters, supposedly, that had to be intentional because we've seen the same police force, the Metro Police, the Capitol Police, act forcefully and aggressively against protesters just this past summer. We saw Lafayette. We saw when the president went to hold a Bible, how they used war methods on U.S. civilians for a photo op. We saw that. So, what's the difference? What happened? Was it a bad day, like I said earlier? No. Someone who had the authority to make a very bad call made an intentionally very bad call. They saw themselves. They didn't see a need to ratchet up the police presence. Remember, these are the same guys that said Blue Lives Matter. These are our friends. These are some of us. And that leads me to my next and final point. Some of the people who were present at these protests undoubtedly will be found to be former veterans, like the individual who lost their life, former or current law enforcement, and multiple of them have already been shown to be elected officials, one from West Virginia, the other from Pennsylvania. So let's stop pretending that our problem in America is that we need to get rid of the bad cops, okay? The institution itself is rotten. Yesterday is damning evidence of that. Completely damning evidence. There is no argument to be had after yesterday. yesterday showed us January 6, 2021, a date that will live forever in American textbooks, history textbooks, as the day an attempt on treason was made, incited by the active President of the United States. That day will live as proof forever that the institution of policing and law enforcement in the United States of America was made and always has been made to oppress and abuse black and brown people. It was never made to hold white people accountable. It never will be. It never can be. A system that in its original intent was not meant to be evenly distributed, evenly applied, can't just be altered through incremental change. You can't just seed out the bad ones. Yes, there are bad cops. Yes, there are cops with good intentions. I don't want to say good cops because my final point is, how can you be good in an inherently bad system? How? That's what I'll leave with. That's my opinion on that matter. I'm curious though, what your thoughts are. What do you think will be the lasting impact of this? Do we not look weaker to the world right now? Is that not a concern to have over the next coming years, months, days, weeks? If I'm an adversary of the United States right now, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking these guys can be had. Look at how easily these group of ragtag citizens accomplish this. Now, an organized state who has intentions to legitimately harm the United States, they could be looking at this and saying, these guys can be had. This is a failure of U.S. intelligence. This is a failure of law enforcement. This is a failure of leadership. And there has to be severe consequences. It has to be. So that no one ever thinks to do anything like this ever again. That the thought of it alone makes you shiver. There has to be severe consequences. Or else, what are we doing here? I know one thing. If there are not severe consequences, then we know, once and for all, that we are at a point in American history where America is no longer denying the inequity. America is no longer denying that she is not racist. That she is racist, I apologize. America is openly saying, this is what it is and this is what it will be. What are you going to do about it? That's one thing that I take from this. So we will see. I'd like to hear your opinions, your feedback in the comments. Please like, share, subscribe, and more content to come.